Hi, my name is Victor Bishay. I work for Google, and I look after the cloud business of Google. Most of us know Google from our consumer world, but today I want to highlight a couple of things about why Google got into this space and how it relates to what we've been talking about all day around financial inclusion. So if you think of cloud in general, there's been a lot of discussions on it. But if you look at these main factors, these are probably the main reasons why companies go to cloud. And I just wanted to highlight one interesting thing is, if you look across, traditionally, a lot of companies would think the main reason cloud was successful was OpEx versus CapEx, reducing cost, removing undifferentiated IT tasks to a different provider. But as you go along the value chain, what you will notice is more and more, there's certain things that you start to be able to do with cloud that you could not have done previously. And that's, I think, the main driver we're seeing today of cloud. When we talk to an HSBC, they're using Google Cloud, not for some of these reasons, but in fact, to start to gain certain insights, to help them with some more innovative prediction models, things that you could not have done traditionally. And so I think what we're starting to see more and more as these cloud services evolve and improve is that the level of innovation that you get could not have simply been done before. So it's not a matter of which operating model, but it's in fact all about the use case. Once you reach certain use cases, cloud almost becomes a default reason to use some of these things. And I'll highlight some of them very quickly today. So just a brief 2-minute history on how this happened for Google. There's, few companies that do this, but from a Google point of view, if you think of Google traditionally, you probably use some of these services on a daily basis. Each one of those services has 1 billion plus users globally. And so when you have to think of if for a Chrome usage or Google Maps or search, what are the key aspects? This service has to be always up and running. It has to reach people all over the world in emerging markets and areas where there might not be good connectivity. It has to be always available. And a lot of that tech that built these applications that are being used by 1 billion plus users is the same back-end infrastructure that was helped to build Google Cloud. So the concept of Google and why they got into cloud is they took some of these services and they said, why don't we productize them and then offer them to organizations that they can use them for their own services. Right? Now, one of the key areas we wanted to discuss is security. Now, of course, because Google had to serve 1 billion plus users, they've probably been they're usually aware of hacks, of security issues before most organizations, just because of the pure scale of it. But there's a couple of key things I want to highlight, which is important to us when we talk about regulations and finance in the cloud. The first thing I wanted to highlight is when you talk about Google Cloud, this is not a consumer offering, right? And this is for any cloud provider, by the way. These are B2B cloud offerings where you own your own data, where you provide your given keys, where you manage really the security for it. So when you understand that this is a key differentiator when you think about cloud as opposed to thinking about consumer services in general. So this is not the advertising world of Google. This is in fact using infrastructure that powered some consumer services, and you use this same infrastructure to host your own data, to use your own key management services, all data is encrypted, etc. So this would be your own data. That's a key, very important identification. So in effect, it becomes almost a tenant. Instead of being inside your data center, you are now a tenant in a larger data center somewhere else. Right? Now, I mentioned earlier that the interesting thing with cloud, other than the aspect of security and the aspect of being able to to make use of the law and scale of the amount of scale that these big cloud providers can provide you, so it reduces cost, of course. An interesting thing is the level of innovation. because all the time there's more and more services and innovations coming. Now, one of the things that a lot of people associate Google with, of course, is data, machine learning, artificial intelligence. These are some of the tools that Google uses, but the important thing to understand is, and that's why I was mentioning earlier, now cloud becomes almost something that you need to be able to do this, is even on the hardware level, Google uses something called the TensorFlow processor unit, which is the chipsets, in fact, are pre-designed to help you do machine learning algorithms. So it doesn't use traditional hardware anymore, but in fact uses very custom hardware to provide these specific workloads. Now, most of us probably use daily products from Google that use machine learning. Machine learning and AI are almost now built into most Google products. So for example, one of the most famous ones is like the translation API, right? So Google Translate uses a lot of machine learning to keep improving, and depending on data sets and iterations, it gets better at identifying translations. Of course, translations in certain languages, Arabic being one of them, still have ways to go, but they continuously improve. The reason they continuously improve is because the more data is given, the more accurate it becomes. What we're providing from a cloud point of view here is, instead of you just going as a consumer to Google Translate, you can use that same API that was trained and plug it into, if you're a bank, for example, into your contact center chatbot, into your omni-channel, into translating documents. So you start to use some of these same components, some of the same pre-built machine learning APIs and put them into your system. Or you can build your whole phone model. So I think with machine learning, it's a big journey because it's a complex environment. But what we're trying to say today is you don't need PhDs in artificial intelligence to start to do some of these interesting, innovative things. These products have been built out of the box that you can start to use, or you can start to train your own data sets. I'm going to highlight just one example of how something like Vision API, which is Vision is our image recognition API. How is it when you put a picture that Google understands, even if you've never uploaded this picture before, that this is a picture of a tree or a picture of a house. And if you think of any industry, machine learning and AI now has a factor in it. If you use Google Photos yourself, you're now seeing that your kids can be labeled and they can group all the pictures that have your kid information just because of the prediction models that starts to understand that this face and this face is the same person. So let me go over something quite simple. If we look at these two pictures of an apple and an orange, most of us as human beings immediately understand which one is the apple and which one is the orange. But if a computer had only seen those two pictures, and we add this third picture in, and the computer didn't know it's a mango, or you live in a country where mangoes, not like Egypt, but a country where mangoes aren't famous, you might not know if is this really a apple or an orange, because it could be one of the two. So the idea of a lot of these analytics tools and a lot of machine learning and prediction is the more data given, the more accurate you become. Let me give you a much simpler example. If you look at these two pictures, I think we can all tell the difference between a mop and a dog. But look at this. Which one is the dog and which one is the mop? Right? It could start to get more and more complex, right? And again, this is back to the more data and the more training you provide, the more accurate your prediction will be. And that's the biggest advantage of this cloud, is you are using the data that has been used and trained over the years. So when you look at an image recognition tool from a cloud provider that has seen millions and billions of images, that becomes much, much more accurate to predict new images. So in fact, the Vision API that I mentioned earlier will be able to tell you this one's a dog and this one's a mop to a very high degree of certainty. Some of these pictures that are being uploaded, this is the interesting thing, are not necessarily pictures that existed in a database earlier. These are new pictures. But because of the machine learning algorithms and the amount of data, you start to predict as a new picture comes in. This is the same thing with natural language understanding, for example. When we talk about chatbots, I could be saying a sentence in a natural language that exact sentence has never been said exactly before. But because the machine understands language and understands grammar, it starts to understand my intent. Again, this is because it's been given many different kinds of sentences and language, and so it's been able to start to understand what is a correct language and what is not. So this is the idea here. You train the model. You say, this picture is a dog. This picture is a mop. Now when you put a new one, it'll be more accurate. Let's talk about starting to think of using multiple use cases at the same time. So the image recognition provides me with an ability to, for example, do character recognition. So if I can see certain letters, now there's a program, some of you maybe on your Androids have, called Google Lens. It allows me immediately to do character recognition. But there's also, I mentioned earlier, translate. Now let's think of workflows and ideas where you start to build from these building blocks and create your own innovation. This is a simple example of using two different machine learning APIs. I'm using the translation. In real time, I'm also using the character recognition. So I see a sign I don't understand in Russian. I put my phone. It translates it. It actually, it understands the image, gets the letters, then it translates it. And so in real time, I understand. Can you see the amount of use cases we can start to do? And these are the kinds of innovations that I'm talking to that really cloud can help us with. You can use it in almost every aspect in the financial industry, whether it's about fraud detection, whether it's about knowing your customer better, whether it's about interacting with your customer, whether it's about digitizing a lot of the records that you have. There are so many use cases that can be used from these machine learning and cloud building blocks. So that's what we want to talk about today. It's not about where do I host and should I use my own infrastructure or someone else's infrastructure, and is this more secure? But in fact, what is the use case I'm trying to solve? And can I do it? And now a lot of these tools are available to us. So we've democratized this idea of machine learning. That's the big advantage of it. Let's look at something that's more serious. You know, for pre-diabetic patients, the retina starts to have certain dots that tells you if that person is diabetic or not. Historically, ophthalmologists would have to look through a lot of different pictures, and sometimes the accuracy is not 100%. They might miss a few spots. So this is something, and you can see the link here for it. This is something that Google did some research on and really helped the medical community here. Is if you imagine if you put many different kinds of pictures like we did earlier, and every time you put a picture of a retina, you say this retina is healthy or this retina is diseased. Once you've done this, now you've trained the data model. When you come see a new eye, to a very high degree of accuracy, you'll be able to see if this person should be diagnosed or not. So in fact, this tool is helping trained ophthalmologists, doctors who spent years studying, but this tool can provide them more capability than what they had. So this is what I want us to remember is innovation and machine learning can probably be used in every aspect, and it's not here to remove or make any kind of job obsolete. In fact, it's here to enhance these jobs and give me more tools to do my job better and to provide better accuracy. Right? Thank you very much, guys.
Victor, thank you for that very insightful overview of some of the great opportunities that cloud helps to enable, as well as making the connection to machine learning. And I think it was a really important point we found in the IIF's machine learning studies, the emphasis on cloud as being a really critical enabler in terms of helping banks and insurers, for instance, to be able to get all their data into a single data lake and to enable those analytics. But it also reminds me of a point around the opportunities with quantum computing. And we recently had Michael Brett of Rigetti Computing both speaking at our annual meeting and on our FRT podcast series recently. And one of the points he made was that the banks that are investing the most in cloud are the ones who are more likely to be favourably disposed to the opportunities of quantum as that increasingly emerges. I want to just perhaps give you the opportunity to respond to that before I throw a couple more questions at you.
Yeah, no, so I think one of the interesting things that we're going to start to see is And this is back to the law of scale that I mentioned. There's so much research happening, to your point about quantum and others, and it's a race. And in fact, it's one of those things where there's multiple cloud providers innovating on a daily basis. And so I always say, me as an organization, I take advantage of that, right? And the world is becoming truly multi-cloud. So one of the things I mentioned HSBC as an example. HSBC famously uses actually multiple cloud services for multiple reasons, right? And so what we're starting to see more and more is companies will start to find out where they can get this best usage, right? So as there's more innovation around, prediction models with TensorFlow, with quantum computing, with today there's things happening around natural language understanding, which is a big field on its own. There's a lot of technology happening around how to build faster applications. Each one of those tools, these are tool sets that we use, right? So the key for us, if I'm thinking from an organizational point of view, for me, I would say, try to first start. I think that's the best way to start, because the technology is there, and the technology is always going to be impressive. And every day you're going to be hearing more and more capabilities with some of these cloud providers. But I think using tech for tech's sake might not always be, in my opinion, the best approach. I think the best approach is we're reverse engineering. The best approach is, what are we trying to solve? Are we trying to do complex algorithms that need a lot of computational power? Then maybe we can use one of these solutions. Are we trying to understand our customers better? Then maybe we have to look at prediction models. Are we trying to build an omni-channel capability that can be agile and can be updated and can be easily accessed? And in each one of those, then you can dig down and see certain tools that will help you with that. So I think the key with a lot of these new technologies, and they'll keep coming up, quantum is one of the big ones, will be figuring out first where I am in that journey. Because every organization has, the speakers earlier were talking about the difference between how fintech has now been incorporated with the larger banks, and now there's a whole ecosystem. You have to figure out where you want to fit in that ecosystem. Are you going to be digital first? Are you going to be trying to solve issues? Do you have legacy complexities? And even with that, there's always solutions for that. So one of the things that I wanted to mention is, for example, and you've highlighted that before, Brad, is for example, today we're starting to see with certain regulations but where do I put my data? Right? That's a very important issue for us, right? You will notice in most cloud providers, so Google, for example, has a solution called Anthos, which we launched recently. And there's other cloud providers that are trying to figure out this. And basically, one of Google's innovations, when I was talking about those 7 or 8 products that 1 billion people use, Google was using something called containers for the last maybe 15 years before it became a product. And containers is basically the ability to build applications that are portable, and it's easier way and a more agile way to build applications. This was only built in the cloud. So Google has a solution, for example, called the Google Coronaries engine that does this. Now, what we launched recently, only 6 months ago, is that same solution. You can host it on-premise. So then all of a sudden, some of these capabilities that might seem very complex and very hard to do, or maybe you can't host in a different environment, you can actually host in your own data center.
And
so
if I can interrupt on that, because I really like the example you gave a moment ago about HSBC using multiple clouds, and the solutions of multiple clouds and multiple vendors at times is perhaps part of, it helps to I think, remedy or mitigate some of the regulators' concerns around reliability or dependency. But I think one of the great attributes of Google Anthos is it has the ability to operate on Google Cloud, on the on-prem infrastructure, and actually on other cloud service providers,
Correct.
if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. And I think that's what you're going to start to see more and more is, because the world is going to open source, so this solution I mentioned, Kubernetes, this is a management platform for containers. It's actually an open source. It was invented within Google, but was given to the open source community. And what you're starting to see is you can actually use that piece of tech and host it not only on your own premises, but to Brad's point, you can host it on a different cloud provider, on a Microsoft or an Amazon or a third cloud provider. And so what you're going to start to see, you're going to see a lot of cross-innovation, where you, and I think we are benefiting as end customers, as end users, with this innovation, is the more it becomes open source and the more portability becomes, that I can control my own destiny. And that's very important for companies that are thinking about, you know, where I'm going to be in a few years' time, where is my data going to be, how can I make sure that I'm the owner of my data, as I mentioned earlier. With a lot of these open source tools and these portability tools, I build my own solutions, and the cloud for me is just a tenant. Tomorrow I can move from this provider to that provider. In fact, I can sometimes, and most big companies will do that, balance between multiple providers. So I'm not locked in, or I'm not in a certain cloud. But and the other point I wanted to mention is the making use of every innovation that you find. So for example, this Vision API, for example, this is maybe something that Google is innovative in. Then I'm going to use this specific API from Google to help me. And then from another cloud provider, there might be something very interesting around IoT, or something interesting around blockchain, or something that I really want to use. You start to make use of this. It's really democratized it. And basically, you think of cloud, in my opinion, now as a toolbox that is always evolving. There's a lot of investment in it. People are updating it. And you can make use of what you want from these different providers.
We've run over time, and I'm conscious that we don't want to keep you from lunch. I do want to close this session with a couple of quick comments from the IAF around some of the work we've done on cloud and some of the research papers. Daniel Puhathan is in the audience and will be speaking later today, and he's been our lead co-author on those pieces. We've found that in a lot of the dialogue with the regulatory community, the discussion, I think, has matured and evolved a lot over the last, let's say, 18 months, that we've moved from perhaps some of the initial questions around whether cloud is introducing new risk into the system to perhaps recognising that it's actually more about the risk of not moving to cloud and of having to maintain older infrastructure and not able to keep pace with changes in customer demand along the lines of some of the particular innovations that Victor's highlighted. And rather, we've found that the concerns from the regulatory community increasingly are gravitating specifically to reliability and concentration issues. And I guess, at a very simplistic level, a notion of if the industry all increasingly relies on 3 major cloud service providers and one of them goes down, does that take a third of the industry down with it? And I think it's significant that it's a valid question to ask. I think we still need to work through some of the dynamics and the metrics of concentration. You know, if 3 banks are using a particular provider for 50% of their data, it's a different kind of concern than if 20 banks use it for 5% of their data. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done, and we called this out on our most recent IAF paper to better explore and understand these metrics. I'd also note we often get the question from regulators of should we be thinking about the cloud service providers as critical infrastructures? And again, we addressed it in our most recent paper. It's a really difficult question because on one hand, I can understand the instinct to think of them in that way. But at the same time, it's very difficult as to how you would actually operationalise that. Would you be talking about it from a financial services perspective and saying, oh, we want to go and ring fence the bit of Google Cloud or the bit of AWS that deals with financial services away from the rest of that provider? Firstly, I'm not even sure that that's possible, but secondly, it may actually be counterintuitive in terms of wanting to incentivise investment in that technology. Yeah. And if you instead take a cross-sectoral view of a particular provider, you perhaps get into extraterritorial issues when we have those providers often based in one jurisdiction but critical in another. So I think there's a lot more still to be worked through in that particular topic, and at the IAF we'll continue working with our member firms and with the cloud service providers in exploring that issue further. So please join me in thanking Victor for giving us a great overview of this new technology.